Okay, good. Thank you. Well, I'm Gaël Blondelle. I work for the Eclipse Foundation. And
hello. Can you hear me? Is it working fine? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm the other one.
Alberto from OpenNebula. And the topic today, so actually that was a proposal from Alberto about how about we talk together at FOSDEM about European open source. And so I think you proposed the topic and I proposed the title, which is European open source a thing? Because, well, over the last, I don't know, 2-3 years, maybe more, I've been in lots of events where I see people who want to do more open source because they think that open source is good for Europe. But at some point, there is always somebody who starts with the idea that, well, open source is cool, but what about we would do open source and try to limit it to European companies, to European stakeholders or stuff like that. And so that's what we want to discuss today. So we prepared it like a list of questions. We expect that some of you maybe want to change your point of view. I think that we will have different point of views on some of the topics. And, well, let's start. Do you want to define European open source?
Okay, well, I would like to explain a bit the how selfish I am, because this whole session for me personally is...
The microphone's not on.
Second?
Yeah, the microphone is not on.
It's on.
I think it's on, but just...
Yeah.
Try to speak as loud
Hello.
as you can.
Second?
Just speak louder.
Louder, like that. Can you hear me without the microphone?
No, but you need to use the microphone because we are recorded.
For the live stream, but everybody can hear, even though the
Okay.
microphone doesn't sound.
Yes?
No,
More?
no,
No?
you have
No?
to really push that. Or share the bubble.
Yeah,
That's
let's
for the
share that
beginning.
one. No
Okay.
problem. That will be a bit painful,
Ooh.
but we will manage.
We're sharing stuff. Okay, so I just wanted to explain for me personally what this session means. It's, as Gaël has mentioned, the concept of European open source has been around for a while. It's been in the last 3-4 years that it's been discussed within this kind of new geopolitical environment in which we all live now, and also especially at European level. So for me, I'm one of the people that's actually pushing for this concept to be something different from other stuff. But I can confess I have my doubts about how we define European open source and whether that is something that might be divisive or counterproductive. Even have my position, let's say, and that's also part of my job, and I'm happy to say both from my personal level and professional level, I agree on the things I kind of defend. But I also have, as a European, some doubts about this and what this might imply for the open source sector. So for me, this session is also about learning what all of you think about this, and just because we thought that it was about time to have an open discussion and an open debate within the European open source community to the implications that this concept might have.
Yeah, so maybe just also a few words about me. So I work for the Eclipse Foundation, which moved to its legal incorporation to Brussels 2 years ago. So, and that's very important for us that we are a global organization established in Brussels. Because when it comes to the answer to what is European open source, I think that from my perspective, at least, open source and free software, that's everything we do where you can use, study, modify, and redistribute the software. And there has nothing to do with Europe. So that must be done in Europe, outside Europe. Everything that is written in Europe should be usable everywhere else. We should be able to use. So that's really sticking to the definitions of the FSF and the definition of the, well, the open source definition. So still, I think that we can have a specific approach to open source in Europe. That's how we help European organizations, how we help European companies do more and understand better in open source. And that's also why I wanted to start with this this topic, because every time I go in a conference, I have been in conferences where people were we are telling, yeah, well, we get money, we invest in open source, and then we have the problem that what we do in open source could be reused by non-European companies. I am thinking, oh my God, oh, that's so fucking wrong. That's why do you do that? Why do you do that? So that's really one part of the message I wanted to share today. I think we agree on that. Still, I think that we should be more diligent in Europe about helping European organizations, helping European companies, helping universities do open source, produce open source, publish open source, and also be more ambitious about how to use open source as a vector to project technologies and to project ideas in the rest of the world. We can come back to that.
Yep. So I think, I mean, from my perspective, coming from the European open source industry sector, let's say, as a technology provider, as a company that produces open source and makes money out of the services we provide to customers with this, I mean, I think we share that concern that, I mean, open source cannot be something that in any way limits who's going to use that, puts any barriers to who can improve the technology or contribute to that technology. From my perspective, I mean, I've also been involved at several of the European initiatives for things like data sovereignty and cloud sovereignty, this kind of discussions, things like the European Alliance for Industrial Data, Edge and Cloud. That's something that the European Commission launched a couple of years ago. So for me and other people in the sector, I would say, I think exploring this concept of what European open source means is kind of a natural step after we discuss the problem we have in the market now with cloud providers. So from our perspective is, okay, we recognize, we identify there is a market failure in Europe in terms of access to different cloud providers or the dominance of a number of non-European hyperscalers. You all know the names. Let's fix that because the European players are playing in disadvantage here. So for us, the next step is, okay, so what are the technologies that European cloud providers are using? Are those led by European organizations? Are those roadmaps defined in Europe, or are those technologies defined and implemented by non-EU companies and organizations? So for us, it was like the next step. Like, okay, what if we apply this sense of this concept of sovereignty, of technological autonomy, let's say, also to not just the proprietary software, but the open source software that supports all these cloud infrastructures in European cloud providers, but other companies as well. Can we do that? I mean, can we get to some understanding of what that will imply for Europe in terms of getting the industry involved in producing and maintaining the technologies that they consume, not just be mere spectators of what other companies and organizations produce outside Europe most of the times? So that was the kind of the next discussion we had. Any
question
yep.
at some point, or maybe
so what?
Somebody wants to shout or say that.
What do you think? What do you feel about the concept of European open source?
It's an oxymoron.
Why?
Good.
Can you repeat what you did?
It's an oxymoron, he
It's
said.
an oxymoron.
Why?
Will I explain why it's an oxymoron? Yeah, I just don't understand where you put that adjective in front of this noun, right? I mean, it's like you can do that, it makes grammatic sense, but I don't understand what the meaning would be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I can explain.
So for me, it's okay. This is still not working on
And
the
it's for
screen.
the live stream. So.
Yeah, it's working for the live stream. I think we agree. And to be honest, that's certainly not the controversial part in it. I think that, and the point is that yes, open source is global, and everything that intends to limit open source scope is certainly not what we want. Still, that's more to not take it as an adjective, but to take it as okay, we have open source is global, and what we may want as European citizen working for a global organization, or as another European citizen who is leading a European company. What we may want is to have a different strategy, like an industry strategy to sustain and develop open source better, differently in Europe. And
So I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
And so that you should have policies and frameworks and a whole bunch of other types of things. But let's use that example, right? Water forms the shape of the container that it's put in, right? So when one talks about what water is, right? One talks about the fact that it's in a bucket or in a cup or in something, because the framework gives the structure to the water. But you don't talk about whether the water is going to be bucketed water.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't
well,
make sense.
We are not.
Right?
Okay. I'm French, in Spanish, so it's possibly grammatically not the right approach to the topic in English.
So then we can have a discussion, right?
But at least I think that we set the stage for the conversation. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's an accurate term, but I think there's a missing word at the end of it. It should be European open source industry.
Yeah.
Because for me, like, it seems like it's very.
The question, the comment is that it should be European open source industry. Yeah. And that's another aspect
Because
that I
for
like
me-
a lot.
Yeah, because for me, I think it's the only concern I've heard, like why this matters, like, is the one about competition. So competition with U.S. and other global companies, and is predominantly sort of like an industry concern. I think, for example, like there might be other concerns around sort of like governance of open source projects, like that are based in Europe or have predominantly sort of like European contributors and things like that. But from my experience working with those projects, none of them have sort of, and at least intentionally, sort of like isolationist sort of like tendencies. They might be isolated just by fact of like who they know or who they
Not
work
enough
with.
diversity or something
Yeah,
like
but
that.
There's not, but there's not. It's less about lack of outreach rather than we want to be isolated. I think most of these projects would rather be not seen as European, but rather as part of a more open source movement.
You want to react?
So if we could please just have the speakers call on anyone who wants to speak, we'll bring the mic to you, and then you have to speak really loudly into the mic. But please call on people and let us know. We'll bring the mic to them.
Okay. So my take on that is that, yes, there is something that we could define as European open source industry. I think there's also something we could call the European open source technology. And from my perspective, that is open source technology whose roadmap and whose governance is controlled by European organizations, yes. Doesn't mean external or non-EU actors cannot, or contributors cannot join that community or contribute to that technology, but the roadmap, the vision of that technology, the values, if you want to talk about that, the governance for this that control those technologies are under European hands.
Sorry, before I have a slightly different opinion, and my opinion is here on this question 7. I think that definitely one of the advantages of open source is that we move the needle from having access to proprietary IP to having the skills to study, to understand, to master, to evolve, to develop the open source software. And I think that what we need to do, what's the next step? So you represent a relatively small company. And I think that we have a vibrant ecosystem of lots of small open source companies in Europe. And I think that what we need to do to go to the next step instead in terms of European power in open source, technology impact in open source, is to involve the larger companies. And in Europe, we have a characteristic which is that the larger companies are not software companies. There are automotive companies, there are aircraft companies, there are utilities, etc. So we have a lot that is being done in terms of policies in engaging the government. So we have governmental support, etc. But I think that if we really want to get more leadership from Europe in this topic of global open source, that's really when we manage to involve the big companies. So we work, for example, with automotive companies, mostly Germans, but we have Volkswagen, Mercedes, Bosch, Continental, ZF, etc. So that's companies that it's very interesting. Some of them have been doing have been doing software for a very long time, embedded software, etc. And they are slowly getting to use open source to collaborate together. And I think that's really fundamental, because they are likely about to create software that will be game-changing for them, but also for the rest of the industry. So that's, I think that there is a uphill battle, which is, okay, what can we do with open source? And on the other side, you have the big, the GAFAM and big software vendors. We don't have this big software industry in Europe. But open source is really a tactical and potentially a strategic tool that can be used by all our industry. And one of the problems is that in this industry, all the managers, they have no clue about software. They have no clue about open source, even less, because and so they think that they hear about open source like, oh, it's open, it's cool, etc. And I think that collectively we need to propagate the message that, well, doing open source is, you need to take care about your community, you need to take care, you need to have a governance, you need to have rules of code of conduct, etc. And so that's really something where that may be counterintuitive for them when you talk to, I don't know, the CEO of an automotive company. That may be counterintuitive for them that open source can be good for them, but I think that when it will be good for when they engage with open source, that will also be good for you. Because they need you, and that will really grow how we collaborate in open source. Because for the moment, and that's the reaction and what creates the fact that people want to talk about European open source. That's exactly what you describe in where is the governance. And for the moment, I can understand the frustration of some European actors, not the system integrators, because system integrators, they take the technologies, they create a solution with this technology, and wherever the technology comes from, they are happy. But for everybody else, to some extent, the fact that they have those open source technologies coming from mostly the US is, okay, so what is our impact on it? Sorry,
okay.
Go ahead.
Please, if you want to move away from IP, please do not refer to it as European open source, but put another word on it, like European open source initiative, framework, community, something that refers to all the aspects aside from the software code. Because when you're talking about European open source, you think about the code, the IP, and all this stuff. With that, please use a word like a framework or something so that you describe the whole approach.
Also in my mind, personally, that's leadership. Yeah, in my mind, it's more leadership, maybe, so we put it somewhere in the slide.
Yeah, but yes, so when you skip away from IP and from non-Europeans using open source software, and you can, frame it in a better way. So please refer to it to like an initiative or framework or something that you can put multiple approaches to it. But please make a big. Please.
Will do.
Okay.
What he said.
Okay, just quickly, I have one here, then I saw this one next, then there was one up there, then this one, and then here. So I will try my best.
So this might not only work without the mask. One short question about the European open source debate. Have you ever considered not to try to frame it as a kind of license? Because we have seen from the development of the approach of the German car makers to make a German car operating system that they paid horribly amounts of pain when they forked off certain Linux forks and spend a triple-digit amount of millions on something that they then had to scroll back. Thus, it might be more useful to go to open source and give them some kind of label as we're a company and we maintain it, and then eat the liability that comes with using open source and can be contracted, given that the Cyber Resilience Act implies companies in Europe to actually take the liabilities that come from using open source. So instead of making it a licensed thing, you basically go to a certain software stack that you maintain, that you can still freely integrate developments from all over the world, and then you basically put a stamp on it, like if you want to use it, you can contact us, pay us a service level agreement to do the maintenance for that, and then we will also take the liability with regards to the liability that will come with the Cyber Resilience Act, where companies have to accept the risks that come from open source in an IT security respect. Would that be a different spin to actually fostering a money flow into European open source companies and actually create a business model?
I don't know. But we could try.
Good point.
Just a clarification. I mean, I'll just put you something that's going to be a real question that we'll have to answer in Europe in a few months' time, I would say. So let's say we, in Europe, decide that we want to develop a specific piece of technology that we think it's crucial for Europe. We want that piece of technology to be open source. It's going to be funded with European fundings and all this. We managed to get the European industry on board, not just as a consumers of passive consumers of open source, but as active maintainers and developers of open source around this technology. And we want this technology in the long term to respond to the priorities of the European Union in terms of the industry and the geostrategic priorities of the continent. We want that technology to respond to that. So how can we protect that from, let's say, a hyperscaler contributing with 1,000 developers to that project and kind of taking over the governance structures of that project? So how can we, from that scenario, protect that open source technology as I define that? Is there a way we can do that without excluding non-European companies from the governance bodies? I'm asking, because that's going to be a question that we are going to have to respond in a few weeks' time, in a few months' time with thinking about a specific piece of technology that we'll be developing in Europe by the end of this year. It's probably going to be the largest open source project in Europe. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, no,
Oh, yeah.
So here's next, and then there was one over there, another one over there, then over here, and then over there.
So, real quick question, maybe, hopefully. I find it very difficult to discuss these topics in abstract terms. So I wonder, do you have concrete examples where kind of important open source projects, their project management, the governance exercise, or the development happened against interests of European consumers, contributors? And if you have such concrete cases, do you know whether this is because the Europeans didn't get involved or because the decision was really done against them, though they were engaged.
So you want to answer? Go ahead.
Well, there are, I mean, in terms of open source projects that are largely controlled, let's say, by non-EU companies or vendors, I mean, there are a number of examples there. You want me to give you some names? Or?
Yeah, not examples for the projects, that I can understand, but where decisions, project management happened against European interests. I know that many open source projects are, of course, led by US companies and organizations and so forth, but I'm explicitly asking for, controversial decisions, project management governance, because that makes it more concrete.
Oh, sorry. So he's asking me for specific examples in which European companies have been sidelined in some decisions in open source projects. I don't know. It doesn't matter. It's about the risk. It's risk management. So how we prevent things from happening, how we prevent vendors from dropping their support to an open source project overnight and collapsing the sustainability of that project. Because in Europe we have relied for so long on non-European companies to develop these technologies and maintain them that we've lost the skills and the capabilities to take over. That's the problem. We're talking about thousands of millions of euros invested in technology. I'll give you an example of that. So something called the Important Project of Common European Interest on Next Generation Cloud Infrastructure and Services, IPSI-THIS. That's mobilizing thousands of millions from European funding to create a whole alternative stack of technologies for managing the cloud and the edge in Europe. That's only for European companies. And that is going to produce, I think, in my opinion, the largest ever open source project in Europe. Okay. How we protect that if we open it up to Google, AWS, Microsoft, the companies for whom this technology is being designed to neutralize their dominance in the market and prevent them from taking over the edge computing market as well. So that's a practical problem.
Yes, that's a topic on which we will likely disagree, but that's fine. That's why we have a conversation. I think because from my perspective, I think that, and if you talk about IPSE, if you talk about edge computing projects, I think that so there are effectively millions of euros that are spent on helping European companies, and that means companies with headquarters in Europe, because I remember I was in such a project, and one of the comments we had when it was rejected is that you cannot get this specific funding because some partners are not European. So that's not a team with that's not just a company with a subsidiary in Europe, etc. That's really headquarters. So that we have the funding mechanism. That's already in place. And so next, the question is not how do we restrict some of the funding to help European companies. The question is how do we make it effective? Because I think that we have a fundamental problem in Europe about that. Is that we spend lots of money and at some point in research projects, I don't know if you have been involved in those research projects, but in research or innovation projects, we tell people, hey, you need to do open source. And some of them, and I would say 80% of them maybe, understand that they just need to publish abandonware on GitHub to get to check the green box. And they think, hey, come on, we published in open source and we don't. So I think that we also have to do our part and to understand that, yes, when you do open source, you need to build a community, you need to build a governance, you need to, and even, I imagine, I dream maybe that a group of European companies, because they identify that a project that has been created somewhere else is very important for them, takes over, sends enough developers in a meritocratic environment to take over the governance of the project and to have more committers, etc. So I think, there is I know in most countries, in most continents, we have we can see some protectionist approach, and I don't like it, and my organization doesn't like it either. But I think that it's really we should exactly do the opposite. That we have the framework to fund some developments. We have the incentive, or we have the requirement to make the development open source. The problem is that at some point it is lost in some of fine-grained open source initiatives that never reach the critical mass. So of course, when I say that, I have an interest, is that, okay, at the Eclipse Foundation, we can help people group together to reach such a critical mass. But I mean it. I mean that there are plenty of open source foundations. There's the Apache Foundation. We are here in Europe, and we are incorporated in Europe, hosted code in Europe. And I want to see more critical mass of people and companies who group together and have the ambition not to be reactive, but to really, just create the next technology for edge computing, for example. And the next technology for edge computing, that will be open source. Whether it's started bootstrap in Europe, or it's bootstrap in the US, or it's bootstrap in China, everybody at some point will converge to a few of those technologies. So we need to do better when we do open source. And I don't say that for you.
No, I agree. I mean, there's no discussion about that. So I can tell you the next big tool for Edge Cloud in Europe is going to be open source. So, and that's it. And that involves the main industrial actors in the continent. So that's a fact. We only have, it has to be approved by DG Competition and all that, but that's minor details. But if that happens and goes well, we'll have a 5-year-long project developing some first-class open source in Europe. And I agree with you. We have to mobilize, the whole community beyond the small technology providers, and we have to invest those fundings better and more strategically as well. So as a company, for instance, I would love if European projects hadn't been, or Horizon Europe or research and innovation projects hadn't been spending this money in small pieces of software to contribute to OpenStack, for instance, which is our competitor, and not to OpenNebula or some other European providers. So one of the most striking things of the work we've been doing in a couple of years is bringing the main European open source providers into the European research and innovation ecosystem, because they weren't there. People like SUSE, like MariaDB, Limbit, these people had never ever considered even trying to get this funding or contributing to research and innovation projects in Europe. On the other hand, we find most of the US open source vendors, but also cloud providers, very well positioned in that area. So that's something we also have to work on, to mobilize all these resources to actually help European open source companies be more sustainable in the long term and get these contributions more fluently.
So we have a question over here. Afterwards, I registered a question here, then one over there, then I saw one over here, and I saw one at the front. One request, if you want to ask a question, please put your hand up and then try to get eye contact with me, then I can acknowledge that I saw you. It's else a little bit difficult in this large room, so handing over.
So what I think is that, back to maybe this definition part, where we have European open source, I feel like the open source part of that is very much global. So it shouldn't be localized, or it shouldn't be local to any area really. And what then we have in Europe, what we should maybe improve on is those two aspects, the using open source software and the creating open source software. And I can't exactly speak for those major projects which are funded by huge companies, either in Europe or mostly in the US right now. But what I see is just a lot of individual projects from individual people who just contribute to open source, perhaps even in their free time or at a small company or whatever. And right, but they are still the backbone of maybe an entire industry without that industry even realizing. So I feel like this is where we, as maybe the European Union or as Europe in general, could dramatically improve on, is just to focus on those essential projects. I mean, there's this forgot the name. A German fund for exactly those projects, kind of project like the base project, kind of small, but still really important. Yeah, exactly, right. So I would love to see more of these kind of initiatives, and I think that's really important. I don't know if like those governance aspects of open source are even that important. I see it if we are actually the main consumer of something, or we have specific goals we want to realize in open source as Europe. But I feel like just empowering those individuals or companies or anyone who's contributing to important open source projects, regardless of if they have a governance role or not, is really beneficial.
Yeah. Well, I like the topic of empowering people. I think that when we fund open source, we have a topic is that sometimes maybe we don't have enough money going down to the developers, because I mean in some of the places where I hear a lot about open source, sometimes I hardly find the developers, and that's we have the problem on the two sides of the spectrum. I mean we have. On the policy aspect, we have policy people who are talking about open source, and that's fine. I think that we need to potentially do better to characterize what we mean by open source and to make it better consumable by the policy people. And on the other side, we have also, I think, the romantic view of open source being done by individuals. Like what you described. I think that we have, especially here at FOSDEM, okay, we have all the individuals coming for the weekend, etc., all the volunteers. But I think that even in the room, we have also lots of people who are doing open source for as their day job. So I think that I understand the individual aspect. I think that there are also lots of projects that are not really supported by individuals, but by some kind of organization that requires those projects. And I think that after Heartbleed and Log4Shell, etc., I think that to some extent the industry is embracing the topic and trying to, how do you call it, do better and potentially hire those individuals on contractual basis, etc., to take care of it. So.
Yeah, I mean that's something. Any of you attended the Open Forum Europe summit yesterday, but there was an interesting. If you can go, I would recommend if you look up the talk by the was the CEO of GitHub, right? Yeah. It's very interesting. He was arguing about the AI Act and how open source should be left outside the scope of the AI Act because of the nature of open source being run mainly by individuals. But then the contrast is when you go to argue against the the Cyber Resilience Act, then the argument changes, and it says, look, I mean, we are companies. Every open source is at some point commercial. So I think we have to again discuss within, especially in Europe as well, how we explain what we do, how we explain what the community is, and it changes from different parts of the, if you look at the technology stack and different projects, some projects are run by volunteers, some projects are run entirely by the community, some other projects are run by companies alone. Our project we write alone. We control the roadmap, we control the releases, and you're free to contribute. We decide we accept that or not, and that's it. Other projects, they have a different governance. It's a community of companies, and they somehow benefit from that shared shared knowledge, and that's perfectly fine. They collaboration among competitors, and that's perfectly okay. There are different models, and I think they are all okay, but each of them have their own particularities. So this concept of sovereignty in Europe, I think, is especially relevant for those projects in which they are mainly maintained and controlled by companies, by open source companies or other companies. So that's just to frame a bit the discussion. From my perspective, so those are the kind of projects that, for me personally and for others, create some concern in terms of if we develop these projects in Europe and we have this ambition of having the European industry heavily involved in maintaining these projects, how we protect these technologies and these communities from the very best, the very same companies we are creating this technology, not against, but you understand me, right?
I'm here. I would like to come back to the European project.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important. We want to be democratic. It means freedom. And seeing what's happening right now in the world, it's like, woohoo! So democracy and sustainability, I think it's part of the European project. And so how can we be leaders in, and I prefer free software, because free as in freedom, not as in free beer. How can we use that for interoperability that leads to right to repair and that helps sustainability in the long run? So how can we put open source European software to help build the European way of doing stuff, if I can say it like that? And I think that the adversary of European open source software is international closed software more than international open source software. I don't know. When I see that all the Belgian universities are sold to Microsoft, we have a problem. And how can we change that using European companies that are using open source software?
Yeah, those are a couple of big questions. Yeah, I think as we see this debate taking place, I think at some parts of the technological world, let's say, part of this stack, we are happily beyond the debate between open source or proprietary source. That's something. I understand in some other areas it's not that clear. Still, it's a daily sale. You have to fight a lot with users and other companies to trust open source. In some parts, in some areas, I think we are beyond that. So, I'll tell you a very very small anecdote. We had the General Assembly of the Industrial, what's the name? European Alliance for Industrial Data, Edge and Cloud in December, for instance. It's only for it's a body of it's an alliance, industrial alliance set by the Commission or supported by the Commission, led by the industry, only for European companies. Okay, we are defining the roadmap, the technological roadmap for the cloud and the edge and edge. A bit of self-promotion. I have another talk at 5 in the Sovereign Cloud that room about the specifics of this initiative. So we are defining the technological priorities that we need the Commission to help us co-fund in the next years around edge, cloud, and data, only for Europeans. And when we had this General Assembly here in Brussels in December, there are 3 working groups: the Cloud and Edge Working Group, the one for member states, members from different governments. And there's a specific working group for defense and aeronautic sector. And for me personally, I'm old enough to have seen some changes in the sector. For me, watching at these 5 representatives across Europe from the main defense companies saying they understand, they want to use open source. They do want to use open source. They just need help to use open source. But they want. That was surprising for me. Okay, it's the defense and sector, okay? But this is people with a very specific mindset and very critical projects and very, very hard requirements on the contracts they get and all that stuff. They were saying, we want to use open source. We just need to see how to actually put it under the requirements we have in this sector, because that's what we want to do. And they want to contribute to these projects. We just need to tell them how exactly, with the peculiarities and the particularities. But in some areas, we're happily beyond that discussion. And we are, I think, mature. The market in that area, so the sector is mature enough to get into the nuances of what do we mean by open source? Who's controlling this open source? Who's developing this? What are the risks of assuming or using this technology or that other technology? Obviously, I have to confess that that's a debate as a small open source European company. This is an environment that benefits a small company like us and others, because it helps us differentiate from others. But that's what it is. We have the European open source sector, you know what it is. We have a few larger companies, but most of us are smaller. We've been for years producing very good technologies, I think. But that's what it is, so yeah.
The other question. So we have one last question here. I saw many others register this, but we can't take any further questions after this one. So I'm very sorry about those who gave their sign to me, and we can't take your question.
Yeah, thank you. It's not so much a question anymore, given the time, but I think, given what's on the slide right now, is European open source a thing? You talk a lot about governance of it. I think it's about dependence on external actors, which are not in Europe. I think we want to be self-sovereign, so as it's now the hype. But I think we should have expertise in it. So it doesn't necessarily need to be European development. We need European expertise to judge it, and to, if somebody decides to stop that, we can take over. It's not so much that we create it in the first place, but we need to build the expertise not only in development but also in knowledge about using it, promoting it. I think that's one of the things we just lack education in.
Forking a project and being able to maintain that.
Exactly. We need more education on both development and promotion of open source and using it. I think that's the thing. We need European education on this.
Yeah, I think we agree on that. And in all honesty, when I put that sentence, and again I'm French, that may be incorrect English, but my goal was that to bring us to quickly conclude that the short answer is no. But I think that we must have a European industrial strategy for open source, and I think that we at least can agree on that. And we have lots of talks about open source in the European setup, and it was mentioned in one of the questions with the CRA, and I think that on one side, for me that's really interesting to see that the Cyber Resilience Act mentions open source as an exception, but the way it mentions open source as an exception is something that is almost not acceptable for lots of people in open source, because that creates lots of concerns. And so on one side we have lots of incentives to do more open source in Europe, and on the other side we are creating regulations that could break the right to redistribute software. So that would really be a problem. And that was my conclusion. So your conclusion, and we are done.
My conclusion is that the time's up. Thank Thank you, everyone.